Hello, welcome to this video lecture on Plato. This topic is included in the paper Classical Criticism, which is the core paper for semester 5 B.A. English Language and Literature students of the University of Kerala. So Module 1A deals with classical criticism. The discipline of literary criticism in the Western tradition began in ancient Greece in the 6th and 5th centuries BC. The art of written prose literature was developed in classical Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The educated elite began to read and evaluate literature, which in turn led to literary criticism. The ancient Greek critics, critai, of artworks were elite men, cultured, who studied literary texts as artistic, social, and ideological discourses. The word criticism owes its etymological origin to the Greek root krinei, meaning to judge, and the word kritikos, which means a judge of literature. The ancient Greek critics set out to define the difference between good and bad literature and to analyze the very nature and status of literary works. They raised a few questions that have dominated the realm of literary criticism over the years. What is fictional representation? How does fictional representation differ from the real world? Can fiction tell the truth? If so, what is the nature of fictional truth? How does the reader or the audience affect the reception of artistic texts? How does a text or a work of art influence the audience's or the viewer's response? Who decides and on what grounds which texts are good and worth canonizing? Should good literature be defined in technical and aesthetic terms? Or should we judge artworks in their social and political context as discourses embedded within ideological symptoms? From the 17th century onwards, the term criticism has been generally applied to the analysis and evaluation of literature. The term literary criticism has come to encompass three fields of critical inquiry, which includes literary theory, literary history, and literary criticism. So literary criticism generally deals with the understanding and appreciation of specific works and authors, taking into consideration the aesthetic, intellectual, and socio-political influences of the age in which the author lived. There are different types of literary criticism. One, legislative literary criticism, which is a critical endeavor that lays down the rules for writings based on classical Greek or Latin literature. Example, the Augustan critics like Alexander Pope. Aesthetic or theoretical criticism treats literature as an art, as an independent activity of the mind. It probes the nature of literature as an art and formulates theories. Descriptive literary criticism is the most popular critical mode and is directed to the readers. The critic analyzes and traces the influences that have given rise to it and discusses critically item by item. Descriptive literary criticism is introspective in nature. It is a kind of self-justification by the writers themselves. Dryden's essay on dramatic poesy is a landmark. Impressionistic literary criticism, it is subjective literary criticism that aims at presenting the critic's own impression of the work of art. Example of such literary critics include Walter Pater, Oscar Wilde, Virginia Woolf, and so on. Psychological literary criticism is an interpretation and evaluation of literary works or works of art based on Freudian psychology, Adler's concept of the inferiority complex, and Jung's theory of the collective unconscious. It also includes a biographical study of the authors. Sociological literary criticism regards a literary work as a product of social factors prevailing at that particular time. This was propounded by the French thinker Taine, the man, the moment, the race, and the milieu. Marxist criticism is an offshoot of sociological criticism. Archetypal criticism is also called mythological or ritualistic and is based on minute textual analysis. The critic here has to find out some basic cultural mythical pattern of great meaning and appeal to humanity in a work of literature. Comparative literary criticism evaluates a literary work in comparison with other works of similar nature, either in the same language or in different languages. Textual or ontological literary criticism is a minute critical analysis of the structure of a literary work and various elements such as vocabulary, imagery, style, tone, theme, etc. Now, Western literary criticism has a continuous history dating from Plato, Aristotle, Horace, Longinus, and so on. It has a tradition of lively debate and discussion, of close and continual reassessment of literary values and ideals, and of the fundamentals of literary faith and worth. So, the first critic that we are going to look at is Plato. Plato was an influential Athenian philosopher who lived during the 4th century BC in ancient Greece. In setting forth his theory of literature, Plato focused on the great texts from the Greek tradition beginning with Homer. This writer of philosophical dialogues was the student of Socrates, the great Greek philosopher. Plato was the founder of the academy in Athens. Plato claimed that the canonical Greek texts portrayed and endorsed an entire value system. The ancient writers identified certain individuals as good, heroic, and wise, or bad, cowardly, and foolish. They offered a specific view of human nature and the universe. As a philosopher, Plato questions the worldview, false ideas, and values set forth by these writers, giving rise to a number of ideas that have proved central to the discipline of literary criticism. Now, he is famous for his works such as the Dialogues, the Republic, etc. And the technique of inquiry that Plato adopted was dialectic. Plato believed the world was intelligible through and governed by reason. Plato's critical theories are mostly contained in his seminal work, The Republic. His views are often diverse and even contradictory. On the one hand, he is opposed to art as a kind of virtual rather than true reality. On the other hand, he also glorifies the artist and extols art and its role in the lives of human beings. So, The Republic is a famous work, a seminal work. It contains the critical views of Plato. It consists of 10 books. It is one of the world's most influential works on philosophy and political theory. First and foremost, Plato is important in literary criticism for introducing the concept of mimesis. Now, what does the term mimesis mean? It is a Greek term that means imitation. The Greek word originally signified miming, but it is most commonly translated as imitation. Now, what does he say in this theory of imitation? Or what is Plato's mimetic theory of art all about? So Plato turns the word mimesis into a technical term and reconceives it in philosophical terms. In its primary sense, mimesis is the literary author's artistic representation of the world. But to Plato, a fictional representation does not depict true reality. Plato's complex philosophical interpretation is that true reality resides in a metaphysical, divine sphere above and beyond the human world. Plato believed that the physical world inhabited by human beings is just an imperfect imitation of an ideal and a divine archetype. In Plato's philosophy, The metaphysical realm is ontologically superior to the physical world. So, to Plato, mimesis represents things in the realm of appearance rather than reality. The literary author who is inspired by the physical world depends on mimesis for his creation. So, Plato's theory of imitation, the core concept is that art is an imitation of an imitation and is hence thrice removed from reality. So, he says there is an ideal world, a real world. The world we inhabit is not the real world, it is only a reflection or an imitation of that real world. So, art is therefore an imperfect reflection or an imperfect imitation of the ideal world. Hence, art is an imitation of an imitation, a third hand distortion of reality, which is the truth, and therefore, art is thrice removed from reality. Now, on this basis, Plato concludes that a copy of an ideal is thrice removed from the truth. So, mimesis is just a copy, an imitation. What it does, or what the artist does, is to mimic some of the properties of the original or the ideal without including the ideal function. Now, for example, the concept of beauty. So, there is an ideal concept of beauty which the artist conceptualizes in his own manner, and you have individual beautiful entities which you see in the world around, and art becomes an imitation of these beautiful entities that you see, which are mere shadows or reflections. On this basis, Plato concludes that the art of poetry is trivial and inferior and contributes neither to the making of an ideal state nor an ideal citizen. Therefore, poets have no place in Plato's ideal republic. According to Plato, poets are inferior to philosophers. Poetry is a product of inspiration and the imagination, and it appeals to the emotions of the people and affects their hearts. Philosophy, on the other hand, is a product of deliberation and the intellect and affects reason. Poetry feeds and waters the passions. So, this is his main charge against poetry. Plato divides art into fine arts and the useful arts. Poetry, being a fine art, is essentially deceptive and sensuous, and it induces pleasure in people, leading to a psychological destabilizing and even immorality. Now, Plato exiles poets from his republic, citing two objections. Two reasons. One is metaphysical and the other is ethical. The first objection is due to the deceptive nature of art. Art distorts and twists truth and reality, thereby misleading men. The second objection is that poetry corrupts the mind of man, who should be guided by reason and moral principles and not passions. In ancient Greek literature, vice was often attributed to heroes in Homer's epics. In the Pindaricades and tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, virtue often led men to grief instead of happiness. So Plato wants the poets to inculcate in men moral virtues and to impart the message that virtue should be rewarded and vice should be punished. So Plato wants poets and artists to tell the truth centered on a specific conception of metaphysical reality, that happiness depends exclusively on wisdom and ethical goodness and not on power, honor, luck, or wealth. Plato attacks poetry on four grounds: moral, intellectual, emotional, and utilitarian. Poetry lacks morality as it is not conducive to social morality. Poets often cater to popular taste. Poetry also lacks intellectual quality as the inspiration and creation is totally based on mimesis, which leads to art thrice removed from reality. Now, poetry springs from the poet's emotional outlook on things, hence, poetic utterances are unreliable and deceptive. Poetry also lacks the utilitarian function as it serves no particular or useful purpose. At the same time, there is a contradictory view also that Plato expresses in The Republic. Plato also believes that true artists and poets are divinely inspired. So, this urges Plato to put forth positive use of art. So, he also says good poets contribute to the spiritual growth of people and become the moral custodians seeking the welfare of people. If truth is the end of art and not pleasure, then imitation or mimesis has a principal view in Plato's perspective of art. Now, Plato has also propounded the theory of ideas or theory of forms. Now, Plato was highly influenced by his teacher Socrates and also by the philosophical ideas of Pythagoras, Parmenides, and Heraclitus. From Pythagoras, he uh, took the concept of the belief in immortality, the belief in an ideal world. From Parmenides, he took concepts such as eternal reality, that reality is eternal and change is illusory. From Heraclitus, he got a negative doctrine that nothing is permanent in this world. So, Plato's theory of ideas or forms is partly logical and partly metaphysical, and his theory stresses on the objectivity of concepts. For example, man is not merely an idea in the mind, but something which has a reality of its own, outside and independent of the mind. This theory is based on the view that truth is correspondence of our ideas with concrete facts. Plato was the first critic to enunciate the view that organic unity is essential for all arts to be successful. Plato compares a work of art to a living organism, where his organs work harmoniously together. He also classified the poetry into the epic, the lyric, and the dramatic. Plato favored the narrative form and he accepted pity and fear as the proper emotions that should be evoked instead of pleasure. What is the importance of Plato in literary criticism, in the study of literary criticism? Neoplatonists have modified Plato's didacticism to imply that poets imitate reality and not merely copy images of physical nature. As a pathfinder, Plato has firmly established literary criticism and placed it on a high pedestal. In the words of J.W.H. Atkins, Plato's influence remains to the present day that of one of the greatest critics, in the truest sense, a light bringer, ever guiding man's steps to the spiritual side of art. I hope you enjoyed this video on Plato. Ευχαριστώ. It means thank you in Greece. Thank you and stay safe.